Hello noble ones and welcome to Metatron's Academy. So, which is the hardest language to learn? Spanish or French? The first thing I'd like to say before we dive into the actual differences and points in common between these two languages, both at a vocabulary level, grammar level, syntax, word order and whatnot, I'd like to of course underline the fact that if you come from an Italian perspective, also through all the tests that I've done on this channel, definitely Spanish is the easiest language to learn. But what if you come from an Anglophone perspective? Which one would be the hardest? Well, the first thing I'd like to say as we compare these two languages briefly is the idea of lexical similarity. And when we say lexical similarity, we're talking about the words that sound similar. That's like in layman's terms. French and Spanish have a reported 75% lexical similarity between the words that are used in or are in common use during everyday conversation. With that being said, it's important to underline that when we look at these numbers, well, it very much depends on that kind of similarity has to do with the way you write words, as opposed to the way you pronounce them, as opposed to the way they are used in an actual conversation. So even though 75% sounds like it's an incredibly high number, I think that is mostly in connection to the written language. So if you see the same word, so if the languages are written, then yeah, a lot of words look the same. It's easier to grasp what they mean, particularly if you're fluent in one of the two. With that being said, when the language is spoken, it is my experience that normally what I see people say, it is a case-to-case situation, but it sort of varies between a 40% to 60% mutual intelligibility. But when we are looking at the actual difficulty that these languages have, now when it comes to the grammar, the languages also have a lot of points in common, but there are also aspects that make them different. Coming from an Italian perspective, the grammar is closer to Italian than it is to French. Once again, one of the reasons why I was stating at the beginning that it's easier for an Italian to learn Spanish than it is to learn French. One of these examples is the pro-drop rule, in the sense that in Spanish, just like in Italian, we tend to drop pronouns when they are understood by context, or when we're not in a, let's say, emphatic or special case. Perhaps I'll make a dedicated video. In French, that doesn't really happen. So as an Italian, it's more natural to me to drop the pronoun, just like they do it in Spanish. If you're coming from an Anglophone perspective, however, since English also tends not to drop the pronoun, so it's not a pro-drop language, perhaps from that point of view, might be a little easier for you to navigate through a foreign language that at least always, in the majority of cases, expresses the pronoun. So as you can see, it's one of those situations where kind of difficulty very much depends on what you're used to. With that being said, if we talk about present progressive or present continuous, then we are sort of opening a can of worms, because whether you're coming from an English perspective and you say, I am eating, or you're coming from an Italian perspective and you say, sto mangiando, Spanish got you covered. They say, estoy comiendo. So it's the same thing as Italian. They are using the verb to stay, but it functions grammatically very similarly to I am eating, with usually the pronoun being dropped. But in French, we tackle a completely different situation with a sentence such as Je suis en train de manger. Sorry for mispronouncing it. Je suis en train de manger literally means I'm in the process of eating. So it's a completely differently structured sentence from a grammatical standpoint, which can make it harder to remember, not to mention it's a lot longer. And one of the things you'll notice is that I immediately sort of apologized for a possible mispronunciation, because pronunciation is where these two languages enormously differ. Spanish is definitely easier to pronounce. If you're coming from an Italian perspective, even more so, although there will be a few adjustments, of course. But coming from an Anglophone perspective, the only problem that I might see you having when you're trying to choose, but which one of these two languages is the easiest to pronounce, is perhaps the rolled R, the trilling of R that you might need to do. Although then again, if you don't, it's not a big deal, you'll just have an accent. But learning to pronounce French properly takes a lot more work, because it's a Romance language that fused its pronunciation with Germanic sounds, and so it's really an interesting concoction if you think about it. And even though English is technically a Germanic language, although then again there's a lot of Latin in it, it's kind of a perfect in-between. When it comes to French, mastering the pronunciation can be really demanding, and it's going to take a lot of time. And this is not only because of specific sounds that you don't really find in any other Romance language, like the uvular trill, the sort of guttural sound, the way they pronounce the R, but it's also because, differently from Spanish and Italian, French uses a whole range of graphemes, or groups of letters, to represent the same sounds. So it becomes very mnemonic, and oftentimes it's not impossible, but it's something that you need to put a lot of study in if you want to really pronounce things properly. In other words, when you look at a sentence written in French, it's going to take some time for you before you actually have a confident idea on how to pronounce it. Whereas if you look at a sentence in Spanish, most of the times you just need a basic overall understanding of how the language works when it comes to pronunciation, and then it will be consistent. Now, of course, if you're coming from any of these languages, false friends seem to be a problem sometimes. There are false friends between French and Spanish, so you might, see a word and think you know what it means, but you're being completely, you know what a false friend is. In my experience, although from an Italian perspective, I do find false friends in both languages. I do tend to have more false friends with French than with Spanish. But again, it's a subjective experience. I haven't seen actual data on this, so take this with a grain of salt. Word order also is another one of those areas where French is more difficult than Spanish. Maybe not as problematic as pronunciation or even spelling. It's another big problem with French. When it comes to spelling, it's kind of a race between French and English to see which one is the least coherent of all and consistent. But another big one that you'll have to face is the numbers, and you've already heard me complain about that. It's interesting, I do like myself a challenge, but if you're not trying to get into a challenge, then definitely Spanish should be your choice if you don't want to have your head explode trying to understand how numbers worked, particularly in France French. All in all, both derived from Latin, and so they do share a lot of common ground. And at the end of the day, as I always say on these videos, even though there might be an objective difference when it comes to the level of difficulty that these languages present and the number of hours that you might need to put into the study of such languages for vocabulary, pronunciation, grammar, and all the different aspects of language learning, it is always, at the end of the day, a matter of, but which one interests you the most? Because even if you have to put an extra 300 hours or 400 hours, I haven't actually looked at the graph, but whatever number of extra hours you might need to put into the hardest one of the two, if you like that language, you like that culture, you have personal connections, that those hours will actually be easier for you. And a higher number of hours will feel like they require less commitment than a lower number of hours in a language that you're not interested in and you would only be choosing because it's simpler, perhaps for work or what have you. So always make sure to put the information I present in these simple comparative videos within the proper context of where you're coming from and what personal interest and connections you have to these languages. So, which one is the hardest? Absolutely French. Why is it the hardest? Because of pronunciation, grammar is a bit harder, spelling is more complex, there is less consistency, numbers will drive you mad, but all in all, if you like French more, absolutely do choose French. Now, here is the part about you. Have you any experience in either Spanish or French? Do you speak these languages? Have you reached fluency, or do you wish to reach fluency in either Spanish or French? And if you do, which variety of Spanish or which variety of French are you studying? Please let me know in the comments below, and thank you very much for joining Metatron's Academy.